Ladies and gentlemen, Derek Lambert, your host, MythVision Podcast. I am a skeptic. I am an atheist. I am a naturalist. I'm someone who doesn't believe in the spiritual or believe in the divine. I once worshipped a man named Jesus Christ. As an ex-Christian, I used to go to the Christian churches and bounce around between denominations as I continued to study. And after I found critical thinking and continued to actually test the things that I was once believing in, came to the side where I don't believe. But there's a man who claims to be the man that I once worshipped. Now, I may have worshipped him wrong. I may have not understood him properly. This guy is coming to set the record straight. He claims to have been alive for 2,000 years, and his wife is Mary Magdalene. I really enjoyed this conversation. He's actually quite a great guy. Very, very nice guy. But his claims are bold and extremely extraordinary. I want you guys to stay tuned. Make sure you like this video, subscribe and hit the bell, and join our Patreon. I want you to wonder what it would be like to actually carry on a conversation with Jesus. And if you do wonder that, then you might want to watch a show, because this man claims to be that very person. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. Guys, you've been waiting for this show. Well, here it is. Introducing Dr. Robert M. Price. He's practically my granddad. Double PhD, New Testament studies and theology. He's obviously a scholar in the field, but also a friend of everyone. And so thank you for joining us here today, Dr. Price.
Oh, my pleasure and honor.
David Samuel, welcome, man, to the channel. You're finally coming out and saying, hey, I'm here. Welcome, man.
Yes. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And I just want to say that David helps us with the website. You guys can go to mythvisionpodcast.com. You guys check out the Patreon. You can join, help us what we're doing here, and check out all the videos we have. Subscribe to the channel. And like I said prior to hitting record, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We have none other than Jesus, who is located in Australia. You are called Jesus. We call you Jesus. I know you get called AJ, but I'm going to refer to you as Jesus. This is going to be an interesting interview, unlike I think any interview I've ever done myself. But I want to say thank you for joining us today on MythVision.
It's my pleasure, Derek. Yeah.
And what is the name of your website and the YouTube channel, real quick, just for anybody who might be interested?
Well, our website is divinetruth.com. So anybody who wants to watch anything we've produced, we've got thousands of videos on there and so forth. But it's divinetruth.com. And I forget the name of our YouTube channel now, but it's basically the same. Divine Truth is the name of the channel. And so people can get information from both of those locations if after the show, if they want to. Yeah.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to start us out simple. And I think both of our gentlemen here will understand. We've watched a lot of your material. We're acquainted with your shows. So we kind of have the inside look on knowing some of the answers that you'll have to some questions and things like that. Some of these questions we hope are new and not things that have been asked a million times. But I have to open us up just so people have context and know what this is about. You are saying that you are the second coming of Jesus, who was the man in the first century who was crucified by Pontius Pilate and who's the Son of God, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
yeah, no, I'm not saying a lot of that.
Okay.
Firstly, I'm saying that I am the Jesus that existed in the first century, obviously, but I've had 2,000 years of existence. I'm not sort of the second coming of me. I'm the first coming of me. This is just all a part of my life. I've lived 2,000 years. A lot of that time I've lived in the spirit world, obviously, and I've been back on earth now for 57 years. But I'm also not saying that I'm the only son of God or anything like that. All of those statements about what I say are often fabrications of the media rather than what I've actually said. So I'm actually saying that all of us are children of God, but we become a son of God in a special sense by entering a specific relationship that involves receiving God's love to the point of one with God. And that's something that I taught in the first century and that I continue to teach now.
So Yeah, so Jesus and I actually have a few things in common. Firstly, we're both South Australians, so from the driest state in the world. I believe you're from Renmark, is that right, Jesus?
No, from Loxton, which is
Loxton, sorry. Yeah, that's Riverland. Yes, that's right, Loxton.
That's right.
Which is just around the corner from Renmark. Yeah, so that's in the Riverland. And we also share a similar history when it comes to, religion. We were both born and raised as Jehovah's Witnesses. I think you weren't born in. Okay, you weren't born in, right? But you were raised in. You were raised as a Jehovah's Witness.
I was born as an Anglican, and my mother investigated different religions when I was about 7 years of age, and eventually most of my family, including myself, became Jehovah's Witnesses around about the time when I was about 8 or 9 years of age. Yeah.
Well, just out of curiosity, were you in the Riverland or in Loxton as a young kid as a Jehovah's Witness? That's a pretty small, community. Loxton, I would say, would have a population of what, 20,000, 15,000? Or?
Oh, not even that. I think it was about 5,000 people.
Wow. Okay.
We were the very first people in Loxton to become Jehovah's Witnesses, actually. So.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Fair enough. Yeah.
If you don't mind, I think this is. This is so interesting to me that someone would actually, say that they've been alive for 2,000 years since the first century. I think that's right there off the bat is just a fascinating statement. And I think David would agree. Dr. Price would agree. We want to know more. We obviously need to know more. So the first question we wanted to ask that we had written down was about the messianic secret. Okay. The idea in the text of the New Testament is that Jesus is kind of like saying, shh, I'm not, and I'm actually speaking about you in the context. So I'm going to try my best rather than third-personing this to refer to you as this Jesus. And I think that'll make this an interesting interview. You hid yourself. You wouldn't show that. Unless I'm mistaken or the text isn't being accurate, I will ask you to correct the text and say, hey, this isn't right. It almost might be a good question to ask up front. Are there any books that are actually accurate in portraying you completely?
No.
Okay, so we're going to come to the source then, according to this. I want everyone who's watching to say, okay, the book isn't going to give you all your answers. There might be some things there that are accurate. Maybe you can clarify. So were you like openly proclaiming that you were the Messiah, the Savior of Israel in the first century, or?
Well, I was proclaiming that I was the Messiah, not the Savior of Israel. There's a lot of history, I suppose, to discuss if you want to really understand the background of my life in the first century. My father believed, Joseph believed that I would be the Messiah. He had indications he felt from God and from angelic forces that he believed in. At the time, not all through his life, but at the time of my birth, he believed that I was the foretold Messiah. But over a period of time, and by the time I was 5 or 6 years of age, he was really struggling to continue to believe that would be the case. My nature was a lot different to his. I was a lot more gentler person than he was. He definitely believed in the recovery of Israel against the Roman forces. He felt that the Messiah would lead Israel to freedom from Rome. And I had no intention of doing any of that even as a young child. I was a non-violent person even as a young child. So he besides educating me through the priesthood that he was connected to, we lived in Egypt until I was nearly 12 years of age. And he educated me in the local, you could call it, I suppose, the local temple that you would go to. And he educated me there, but he also put me through education trying to make me a soldier as well from a very young age. So, and I was very anti anything to do with war or soldiering. And so my father and I, from a very young age, we entered into what you would call a major disagreement. My father often became violent with me as a result of the disagreements, but I could never agree that I was going to be the Savior of Israel and particularly the Saviour of Israel in the way he understood it. I was going to be a saviour of a kind, but only in the sense that I would be able to share with people what God's truth was about God and having a relationship with God, and also the development of the human soul into a place of a more loving condition. And I started to understand that during my teenage years more than any other time before then. But my father and I had major disagreements about what my role would be. So as it turned out, he still felt that even during my teenage years that I was potentially the Messiah, but I did not agree with him. I didn't feel I was at the time. It was only during my late teenage years that I started to recognise myself as the person foretold in earlier scripture that would be coming. And that was only through my connection with God and my relationship with God that became clear to me.
Jesus, if I'm not mistaken, your father Joseph was part of the Sanhedrin. Is that correct? Or
well, when I was born, he wasn't, but I was born, he aspired to be. And okay. Over the period of my life, by the time I died, he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Yeah. He wasn't present the night that I was condemned to death, but he was aware that was going to happen. And okay. Also, to some extent at that time, he agreed with my condemnation to death.
Wow.
He later regretted that, but at the time, he felt that I was becoming an apostate to the faith and also a major thorn in the side of the Jewish faith. So he was actually, although he wasn't present at the vote, he did to some extent before then agree with people's opinions of me, particularly his friends' opinions of me.
Jesus, if you don't mind me asking, the New Testament portrays, and I don't know how accurate this is because there's a debate amongst mythicists, which are people who think you didn't even exist at all to begin with, and those who say that, there was a guy, but he's mythologized, which would probably fit more in line with what you actually believe about these texts that were written about you. So my question is, did you have a brother named James, or was this man named James just a pseudonym for a baptized Christian or someone that was part of your movement?
Well, my mother and father had a total of 9 children, but I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters while I was alive, obviously. So there were 8 of us totally. My mother had a child die as well in childbirth, so there's a total of 9 children. But I had a brother, James. Thomas was also my brother. I had a number of other brothers. One was named Judas, but not the Judas that that was involved in the so-called betrayal of myself. I had brothers and sisters. I had 2 sisters. They were named after Jacob's 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. So yes, I had brothers and sisters. I was the eldest brother of my siblings. I was born first. And by the time we left Egypt, my mother and father had 8 children.
Was your father Joseph of Arimathea?
Yes, yes. The answer to that question is yes. He was often claimed to be different people in the Bible for different reasons, because he did change quite significantly after my death. You could say he became a believer in what I was teaching after my death. And he was quite distraught about how the Sanhedrin eventually treated me and about my death itself. And so he actually gave up his role in the Sanhedrin after my death. And unfortunately, he was also quite sad after my death, and he felt quite guilty after my death. And so he actually left my mother with James, that's John's brother James, with John. James and John were brothers, not my brother James. There's 2 Jameses in the narrative. And he finished up leaving my mother there, and he went. I suppose you would call it nowadays proselytizing throughout Europe, and he actually died in England. And my mother didn't see him again shortly after my death.
That brings up so many questions,
Wow.
David.
It does.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of people go down these routes of asking you these basic questions, and I kind of want to poke into unknown territory, but are we sticking to the script here, David, or?
Well, I haven't probably answered your first question.
Sure,
you asked about
sure.
the Psionic secret, whether there was some kind of secrecy.
Yeah.
Well,
Let's
Let's answer that, because I think there's
Sure.
an interesting part to that as well, in that most people believe that God is mysterious and therefore a keeper of secrets. And most people also believe that Jesus, being so-called a part of God or God's son, is also to an extent a keeper of secrets. And nothing could be further from the truth. God's intention, and also my intention, because I'm associated with him in the sense that he's my father and I am connected to his desires. Our intention is to share truth with people and to be open and honest with everyone. And so under no circumstances have I ever, or will I ever, try to cover over truth with people. Under no circumstances will I ever try and create secrets or tell people what to do with their experiences with God or with me. And so a lot of the claims in the Bible that I did such things are completely false and written after I died in order to create some sense of mystery. You see, most so-called God men in the past, as you correctly said, I was basically myths were created around me in order to compare me with the gods of the Romans and the Greeks, who had all sorts of things happen to them, some of them including things like walking on water and turning water into wine and all of these other so-called things, which, by the way, also never happened. But, they were just myths created in order to create a following. And a lot of the followers after my death tried to create similar myths in order to have some kind of comparison or competition, you could say, with these other gods of other nations. And in no way was I ever a god. I'm a human just as you are, and I'm a son of God in the same sense that you are. And so all these myths were created in order to put me above others, in order to attempt to force people to listen to my message, which of course is problematic in itself. So so a lot of the things that were created, including the so-called mysteries surrounding myself and my claims, were all false, because I was honest and open with everyone, just as I am now, and I have no intention of covering over any truth, because I do believe that truth is what saves humanity. And I'm talking not just about theological truth. I'm talking about scientific, physical evidence, which to my mind is a large portion of the truth. And these particular things need to be properly explained to humanity. But I'm also talking about the truth about God, and the truth about the human soul, and the truth about why God created us, and where we're headed and where we came from, and the truth about life after death was a big part also of what I was trying to teach in the first century. And in fact, my own death was a demonstration of many of the things that I taught before my death.
Jesus, we'll just ask you to clarify one thing, because you're just talking about your dad, and that's not Joseph. I'm talking about your father, Heavenly Father. We've got lots of questions, by the way, but we're not going to be able to get through most of them. One of the questions asked from in the group, in our MythVision group, is from Melissa in Newcastle, England, that is, and she asked, "Is your father Yahweh? Is it Jehovah? Is that your father, your heavenly father, not your physical father?"
Well, in the first century, I called him Yahweh because that was what everyone around me called God at the time. The Jews referred to God as Yahweh in the first century. And so, and because they also viewed God primarily as a masculine being, I referred to God as Yahweh in my discussions with them in the first century. Of course, God himself, or herself, you could say, doesn't have a name, and it's only a name we've given the entity. God as an entity exists, and the names we give God are really human constructions based on what they believe God to be in most cases. So unfortunately on earth, most people on earth believe God to be a fairly violent sort of a creature, unfortunately. And that's
if you read the Old Testament, that would be true, yeah.
Yeah.
I noticed you actually referred...
Even the New Testament, David, if you look at Book of Revelation, for example, it is saying that I will come and destroy people. God will come and destroy the wicked at Armageddon, and everyone will be, who is an unbeliever, will be erased from the earth. These kind of claims are never going to occur because God's not an unloving being. And also, God doesn't make mistakes in God's creations. So, you know, for us to believe that God would create, the pinnacle of his creation is the human soul, and to imagine that God would create a whole group of people that he would then go ahead and completely annihilate afterwards, rather than just re-educating them, you know, redeeming them, is a completely false belief. So a lot of those beliefs are really based upon the fact that many people want wicked people to be punished. They want wicked people to be, you know, pummeled into the ground, basically, rather than redeemed. And but God wants our redemption, and he's not that interested really in our punishment.
Hold on 1 second, guys.
I noticed actually...
Time out. Okay.
We can...
I was going to follow a question up, David. I think this is important to ask in light of this because...
Sure.
Go ahead. Do you need to say something?
No, I just want to clarify. On a lot of the divine truth, and some of the divine truth videos, you refer to God as Mother God. I don't think I've seen you refer to God as Father, as in male. Is there any reason that you refer to the creator of the cosmos as a female? Just out of curiosity.
The best way to explain that is that God has masculine and feminine qualities, and it's appropriate under certain circumstances to refer to God as masculine or male, because there are certain masculine type of qualities that God does display to humanity. But it's also appropriate to talk about God as female, because there are certain feminine qualities that God also displays. The reality is that God is gender neutral, is the best way of saying it. But God does have masculine and feminine qualities, and he created our complete soul in the image. In other words, he gave our soul masculine and feminine qualities. And by the way, each of us that you are looking at now are not one whole soul each, but rather we are one half of a soul each. So, and these are things I taught in the first century. There are slight references to such things in the Bible, but unfortunately most people who listened to what I was teaching didn't understand what I was saying. So naturally there's a distortion of what they then write.
If I may, Jesus, I have to poke in to get, I'm going to be a little bit of a critic, so to speak, but also ask you a tougher question. So I'm not a believer, right? You love me no matter what. I like that because I love you no matter what. I may not agree and believe what you are saying is true in the ontological sense, but I think everyone can relate to the narratives and relate to this stuff. But most people aren't going to think that what you're saying is the truth, even though I love how you carry yourself and you're kind and you're loving. So my question would be, as just a curious person, if I were to ask you to what could you give me? What could you show me? Even though I know the miracles, I've seen the videos where there's no miracles that are happening right now. You haven't connected in the same sense that you were in the first century here on earth now. What could you give me to prove to me that you were Jesus? You know what I mean? The Jesus of the first century, other than a narrative and like saying what happened. You know what I mean?
It's not important for me to prove to you anything, to be frank. I feel that if you listen to what I teach and decide to connect to God directly, God will prove to you his existence. And also God would then prove to you, God would share his love for you, and you will feel that. And in the process of feeling that, you will learn things that you didn't know before. And that's the benefit of having a relationship with God. Now, to my mind, I don't have to prove anything to you. All you need to do is, if you wanted to do anything, is to listen to what I have to say if you want to. And the reality is that most people don't listen to me until after they die. Most people who have learnt the truth about the universe have learnt the truth only after they've died, because after they've died, they've gotten rid of the notion that this earth life is the only life there is. And so then they have started to investigate further things that they were close to investigating while they were on earth. And so, many of my friends now are even members of the very Sanhedrin that condemned me to death, because after they died, they realized that they weren't teaching the right thing, and that what they were hearing from me was correct all along. And after they died, they decided to embrace some of those teachings, of course, and they began a personal relationship with God after that. And then they learned that God exists. They didn't believe that beforehand. And,
right.
Most members of the Sanhedrin were really atheist in a lot of ways, in the sense that they just really believed in power more than anything else.
But they're not cooking in hell. They're not burning. There's no place of torture and torment. What about a purgatory? Is there anything after?
Well, that's actually an interesting question, Derek, that you just raised, because on some of the Divine Truth videos, and just earlier we mentioned about Divine Truth YouTube, if you just simply search for Divine Truth on YouTube, you'll find all of Jesus's videos. He's got, like you said, I think thousands of hours of content, if I'm not mistaken.
Thousands of videos, yeah.
You speak actually a lot about the hells,
yes.
And like the Christian general mainstream Christian belief is, if you're condemned to hell, that's eternal. From what I understand, from what I've seen from your videos, the hells that you describe can be temporary.
They are all temporary, and they are all for the purpose of redeeming a person. So they're not. The hells are a place of the spirit world which you could say are removed from love. So just like if you go to different places here on earth, you will notice that there are some places that are more removed from love than other places. There's more violence there. There's more, murders, killings, rapes. There's more desire to harm than there is in other places. And you could say even on earth, there are these hellish locations, which also involve the state of the individual who has no hope. Internally, I mean, they have no feelings that there is anything other than just getting as much out of life as they possibly can before they die, even at the expense of others. And the hells of the spirit world are very similar locations. We don't automatically change as soon as we die. We are the same person when we die as we were when we are alive, and where there's no instant acknowledgement of truth when you die, except for perhaps one truth, and that is that you're now still alive rather than having died and thought you would be non-existent anymore and therefore not conscious. And you still realize that you're conscious, so therefore you realize, life must continue. That's about the only change that ever happens to the majority of people who die. And then what happens is their condition of love determines their location. And in fact, the way God's created the universe is the condition of love actually creates locations. And so the hell locations were not created by God, actually. They were created by our soul creating an unloving condition for which it now must live in until it changes its condition. And so you could say the hells are loving creations of the person who's in an unloving state, creating an unloving condition to live in, until such a time as their condition changes, and therefore their love will change, and therefore the location in which they live can change. And it's very similar if you think about it on earth. A person who's lawless is not suited to a peaceful environment, because they will create a lawless environment, and so they have to be restricted. And this is why on earth we have prisons, right? To try to restrict people who are lawless from infecting the peacefulness of general society. And in a way, you could say the hells of the spirit world are the same. They are created by, in this case, the lawless people for a place in which they can live and exist until such a time as they no longer are lawless. And once they choose to be more lawful or law-abiding, and here I'm not talking about human laws, but God's laws, to be more abiding to God's laws, which are all based around love. And until they do that, they must stay in that location. But they can get out of that location at any time. There's no restriction on them moving out of that location, aside from that being the location they like to live in. A person who's lawless does like living in a lawless society. A person who's peaceful isn't attracted to a lawless society.
Right. Love to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Price.
Well, I'd like to know either thoughts or follow-up questions, because there's so many questions to ask.
There's so many questions, exactly.
Are you, I gather you're sort of building followers more and more. Do you have any thought about starting a church or any such thing? That's loosely defined.
But I don't sort of see anybody who listens to me as a follower. To truly follow me, you'd have to live the lifestyle I live, and I don't see anybody around me, or there's very few people around me living the lifestyle I live. So I don't really call them followers. They're listeners, people who listen, and to various degrees. You know, most people listen, and then when they hear something they don't really want to hear, then they turn off, right? And so, you know, for the majority of people, they listen for a while and then they hear something that's a bit confronting emotionally for them, or confronting spiritually for them, or confronting to their current level of faith or hope or whatever it is that it has limited their acceptance of loving ideas and concepts. And then they don't listen anymore. And so for me, I feel that most people listen for a while, and some people, very few actually try to enter this relationship with God that I'm explaining. And those people do experience the benefits of that relationship. But there's never going to be a church. And we may have centres where people come to learn, in the sense of like auditoriums where you can rock up and listen to truth being created in the future. But the reality is there's no intention to set up a church. There's already far too many religions on the planet, and we don't need to start another one. What we need to do is we need to come, as humanity, we need to come to acknowledgement of some fundamental truths. And unless we do that, and I feel anybody can do that, whether you're an atheist or a believer in some religious faith, you can come to an acknowledgement of some fundamental truths that are plainly obvious, both physical truths, you know, like science has discovered many physical truths, but also some spiritual truths, such as if you become a violent person, you're going to, in fact, encourage more violence. These kind of spiritual truths are, I think, self-evident now on the planet. And we do need places where you can come to learn about those particular things, but it's certainly not going to start another religious faith. My feeling is that, and most religion has been created to support some very damaging conducts and behaviours that are engaged on the earth, that begin in the family, actually. And so a family is generally attracted to a religion because the family itself has engaged in specific conduct, particularly parents with children, that they then need some kind of support external to themselves to justify. And so they want to justify it as God told me to do that, or God told me to, you know, example, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So God told me I must beat you as a child, you know, and basically be violent with you as a child before you can learn. Those kind of things are often used as an excuse to, you know, to engage what I feel is abusive behaviour. So, you know, religions are often used as an excuse to engage violent and abusive behaviour. And the reality is this is why many people become atheists, understandably. And in fact, I have found many atheists to be even more loving than many people who are religious. And
well,
in fact,
thank you, Jesus. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and many people who are religious are extremely violent, not only to their own children but also to people of other faiths, and using a religion to back up this violence in any way is completely, obviously, disingenuous and false, and it's just people lying to themselves about their true motives. And so I just feel, yeah,
certainly agree on that.
It's a loaded question, kind of layered, because I feel like I'm probably going to answer one of them pretty simply. Is Satan, the devil, real? Number one, is that something that just books created? And then reincarnation. I've seen a few interviews where some people believe that they were someone from the first century, not just your wife, but there are others who say that they are, they were reincarnated. Let me ask you that first, because that's a loaded question.
Well, you've asked two questions. So the first one was not the reincarnation, whether Satan exists. I think that's an important question. The answer is no. There is no such person as the devil. There are many, many people who used to live on earth who are now spirits who are, you could almost call them demonic in their violence. They are very violent people and who used to live on earth also in a violent manner. And they have carried that violence into their spirit life. They often do influence people on earth, and so they often do have ways. There are ways that a person in the spirit can influence a person on earth quite easily, and so there are what you would call demonic, I suppose you could call them, influences on people on earth. But they are people who used to live on earth themselves, who are in a very poor condition of love. They have very little love in them at all, and they hope to create and beget more violence on earth. And so they try to connect to people on earth and influence them. And many people on earth think then they're being influenced by Satan, like as an entity, but no such entity exists. And in fact, if you think about it, if God is a loving God, there would have been no way that such an entity could ever exist. And there's many logical points there that we could discuss, obviously, regarding the logic of whether a devil exists or not. But the reality is there is no devil or Satan as an entity. So that's number one.
Thank you.
So stop blaming the devil for your actions and start.
We all agree on this, by the way. We're all in agreement here. So then reincarnation, and then I will let David get the next question, then Dr. Bob. That way we don't step on each other. Sure. So the reincarnation issue is you're asked about next. Reincarnation is taught in a lot of different ways here on earth, but basically the fundamental teaching is that once you pass, you immediately incarnate. For many people, there's the belief began with Eastern philosophy, but there was many people that belief was that when you breathed your last breath, they used to believe, this is way back before I existed, that breath entered a newborn child that is just being born. And then that's the way you became another being, basically. And then, of course, since then, reincarnation philosophy has grown for lots of different reasons, and it would take us hours to discuss all the reasons, to be more, I suppose you could say, refined in its teaching than that. But the reality is there is no such thing as reincarnation either. And so... And the way that 14 people have returned, there's been 14 of us who have returned, it's not in the traditional way that people view reincarnation. So whenever anybody claims that we're saying we're reincarnated Jesus or reincarnated, in Mary's case, Mary Magdalene, that's not the case. We are people that have been existing for 2,000 years. All we did was we connected to another body that was created by our parents in this life in order to express ourselves during this life and in order to demonstrate certain truths. And so it's not the same as what people believe reincarnation to be.
Now, there are many reasons why people believe in reincarnation, but every one of those reasons you can logically explain the arguments to if you understand how the universe works and why it appears that reincarnation may exist. And so I'm perfectly happy to answer all those questions, but that would be another 20-hour discussion. You know what I mean?
I'm sure that we've got so many questions we could do 5 to 10 shows, and I'm confident that we're going to. But sorry for butting in. I'll let you continue your answer.
That's no worries. Yeah, you will find almost with every question you ask, every answer I give raises another 10 questions. And that is going to be the case, because for the most part, things are, while things are quite, I feel there's two ways to understand something. One way is to sort of understand a complete overview picture and then start drilling into the details. But what happens in most interviews that we have, including this one, obviously, is we drill into the details without getting the big picture. And I feel at some point it's important that we get the big picture, right? And once we understand the big picture, then we can start drilling in the details, and you'll find all the details fit into that big picture. And I think that's an important way to approach many questions. But it is fascinating to answer the detailed questions, but you will always find when you answer them that there will always be big picture questions that appear as a result of the answer to those questions. Yeah. So my answer, for example, to the reincarnation issue brings up a lot more questions. Well, why do people seem like they have another life or have memories from another life? Or, why is it that certain children repeat things that people who have died used to say, and all these kind of things? There's completely logical answers to all of those kind of questions that do not require that you believe in reincarnation. So I feel sometimes, though, that people like to believe in certain things because it gives them some sense that their own internal confusion right now can be almost ignored or allayed, rather than them having to consistently seek for truth in their life.
I'll go against the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts, I guess. They kind of had some kind of belief in reincarnation, so scribble that out. But
can I just say, though, I'm not suggesting to anybody that they scribble out anything that they have discovered up until now. What I'm suggesting is that there are answers to many of their questions that give them an alternate answer, rather than the belief they may have imbibed, thinking that that is the only answer to those questions. And this is something that I feel humanity does very frequently, and even scientists do it very frequently, where, they all sort of focus in on one area or endeavor of study, and in that process, you ignore the other areas or endeavors of study. And doing that is very damaging to yourself personally, because you will begin to imbibe beliefs that you may then have to adjust later on, or you may even change your whole life. Many of you, I know, historically have been members of Christian religious faiths, and that caused you to change a lot of your life even during those time periods, only to later perhaps regret that, because you realize new things that you've discovered that don't match the old things you were being taught. And so I feel with all discovery, we need to be in an open state where we allow ourselves to discover more and more truthful information. And that does require at times throwing away information that is found to be false. And I suppose in some ways, because I've lived 2,000 years, I've been able to watch people who have believed in reincarnation during that time and see the damages that it's had on their life after they've passed. And I've also been able to watch Christians over that 2,000 years of time and see the damage that has also incurred on their life, even after they've passed. So, what I find myself is that unless you believe the actual factual truth, as God can demonstrate it to us, you will always be disappointed, and you will always be going down roads that eventually end up to be dead ends that you must then turn around and travel back up again before you can go down another road. And I think it's very important for us as humans to realize that there are some fundamental truths that we can generally all agree on, and then begin investigation and be very open-minded about all forms of investigation. What I find is that many people on Earth are only interested in the physical forms of investigation. Now, humanity up to now, scientists have now proven that around 90% of the universe is dark. They can't see it. They've measured its weight, and they realize that there's all these things that you cannot see that exist. And so we now need to start going, well, if that's the case, then it probably means 90% of our investigations need to focus more upon the things we can't see than the things we can. And it is easy to investigate things we can see, but much more difficult to investigate things you can't see unless you know how to do that.
There are other people around and that think that they are Jesus returned. There's a fellow in Russia. I don't know much about him, but I hear he's impressive. I saw Reverend Moon several times, and I know many of his followers. Do you think it's possible that all these people are right? I know Buddhism has the idea that a Buddha or Bodhisattva can manifest on earth in various people at the same time. And I wondered, is that a possibility, or how do you view these others?
1 second.
To answer that question, sorry, we'll just pause.
I'm just restarting. I apologize.
That's all good.
Okay.
And to answer that question, Dr. Price, we really need to get a little bit of what you call, I suppose, context to the question. And the reality is I've met many hundreds of thousands of people who claim to be me. In the spirit world, there are literally millions of people who claim to be me. And I've met many of them in an attempt to help them see they're not actually me. But usually it hasn't resulted very well, obviously. But in the spirit world, there are millions of people who claim to be me. Many of them attempt to channel information to people who are mediums on Earth. There are methods that you can hear people, spirits, speaking to you. And in fact, many people with schizophrenia do actually hear actual people talking to them who exist in the spirit world. And so there are many ways you can actually hear people talking to you from the spirit world while you're living on Earth. And many of the people you mentioned are overcloaked by these spirits who claim themselves to be Jesus. They are not Jesus. I am, but obviously.
I think you've actually met. Have you met them? You and Mary went to Mexico and met the Mexican Jesus, or you? Just from memory.
I've met a few people on Earth who've claimed themselves to be Jesus and had discussions with them, but not the ones you've mentioned. No. Right. But in the end of the day, all of them, it can be proven that they are not, and it's quite easy when, like, for example, a person who claims to be Jesus is going to have had a history of 2,000 years, not just a history of a few years in the first century, 30 or so years in the first century, and then a big gap of nothing, and then a life in this life. Now, every one of the people you mentioned they don't remember their spirit life because they actually didn't have one. And so, the reality is they are just regurgitating information from spirit sources through channels. Not all of that information is false, of course, and it is the opinion of those spirits that they are telling the truth in many cases, but they are not, because they don't know the truth to tell. And so when I see these kind of events happening, and this happens very, very often on Earth, many people who have that relationship with spirits are classified as mentally unstable, of course, in some way. And in some ways, they can be mentally unstable because it's like they are two different people. They are one person when they are not connected to the spirit they're talking to. And then when they let the spirit overcloak them and change their behavior, then they become another person. And frequently, you observe that in these people where they sort of change from being one person to another person. That does not happen to me. I have never changed over my 2,000 years of life in the sense, in that sense. I've never been overcloaked by anyone. And also there is a common view, even with myself, that somehow God overcloaked me. And while I've entered a position of, I suppose you could say, closeness with God because of us being in better rapport due to my acceptance of God's love, I'm not overcloaked by God. I could never be God on earth, and I never will be God on earth. And so, those kind of beliefs are also false. So there are a lot of these people, in answer to your question, Doctor, a lot of these people are very clear what I would classify as mediums or channels of people who used to live and who now live in the spirit world in different locations. And none of them are in the spheres where I used to live. They're all below the 6th sphere of the spirit world. The spirit world has many spheres, up to 36 spheres that we know of at this point. And all of the people you mentioned are overcloaked by people who are in the spheres 6 or lower are from the spirit world. And that means they have not discovered more truth than that. Now, that level of truth is generally more than what people have on earth. And so many people on earth are impressed by these people channeling this information, but the facts are that it still is a limit of the truth. It's not the complete truth that is being channeled.
Jesus, if I might be critical, I want to poke, because this is obviously, I'm trying to gain insight on your answers from these things. This is really interesting. You said you lived for 2,000 years. Now, most people are going to go, you're what, 57, you said? 57 years old?
This body's 57, yes.
So if someone wanted to be critical of what you just said, right? And they said, okay, Jesus, how do we know that you're not overcloaked? How do we know you're saying you're the guy? If we went to the Russian Jesus, he might say, listen, that guy's overcloaked by another spirit. I'm the real guy. And we can do that all day long. How do we know you're the guy? Is there anything you can, or we just have to take that on a faith type thing? Or
no, I don't expect anybody to take anything on faith. And in fact, if you believe the guy in Russia is Jesus, then you're already taking it on faith. And to be frank, that faith is not based upon much substantial, because basically he's just regurgitating Bible teachings that came from 2,000 years ago that in themselves are also demonstrably false. So my feelings are,
I love this, by the way.
If you trust that, then of course you're going to be quite foolish. And I'm not suggesting people trust me either. What I'm suggesting is that they listen to all things that are being taught and analyze them carefully and use their logic and their brain that God has given them to determine the sincerity of a person along with what is actually happening to the person. Now, every single person I have talked to who claims to be Jesus has always had some level of instability in them, aside from myself, of course. And so, my feelings are that you talk to them and you have the personal experience. You talk to them, find out, rather than just believing what the media says or what other people say. Now, if you believe what the media says or other people say, then I think you're pretty foolish too, because at the end of the day, my experience with the media has been they just fabricate things to suit themselves. And many of the things said about myself are complete fabrications, had nothing to do with anything I've ever said or done. And if that's the case with me, then it's highly likely that it's going to be the case with everyone else. So my feeling is investigate the claims and investigate the way of life, investigate the truth. I'm not the same as these other men because I do not wish to have followers, and I never have wished to have followers. I have what are called disciples, and disciples, if in the true sense of the word, is a taught one, a person who listens to teachings and then practices them themselves. And that's what a disciple is, a person who listens to a group of teachings and then through their own experience learns them to be true or not, learns them to be true or false. And what I'm suggesting is that people can engage their own experience here and decide whether, those things are true or false for themselves. So I don't need anybody to trust me or believe me, although if you're going to engage a relationship with God, I am the only person on earth teaching the proper way to have a relationship with God. Now, whether you believe that or not is up to you. But again, that can be proven through your personal experience if you decide to have one. Every other method that has been tried on earth is obviously a dismal failure because if you look at most religious faiths who say they all have relationships with God and so forth, the net result of those religious faiths has been more war, more violence, more strife, and even in families has created strife within families, and even abuse of children has been created to a large degree through following some of these faiths in terms of, the faiths recommending the violent abuse of children, for example, through what's called discipline. And so if you examine the outcome of all of these people who claim they have a relationship with God and then compare it with what a relationship with God should achieve, which I would believe should achieve more love and less war, more peace, less suffering. And if it's not achieving those things, then obviously no relationship with God exists. And so I feel quite strongly that needs to be recognised by all of humanity, not just the people in those religious faiths.
I think we can agree on that stuff. I mean,
I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, I'm for those positive things. But David, go ahead. I'll hog the time if I don't pass the
Derek, we've got so many questions. We're not going to be able to get through them all. That's for sure. We'll have to leave them for another episode. But just back on the okay. So this is an interesting one, Jesus. This is from Chris from the UK, and he asks, do you feel like Paul did justice to your teachings? How do you feel about his very public disputes with your brother James over the requirement to keep the law and the legitimacy of his teachings?
Firstly, you must understand that a lot of the things that are claimed in the Bible are actually written by people that weren't the original writers of those particular manuscripts. So in the case of my life, for example, the gospel accounts are meant to be accounts of my life. And I personally know all of the gospel writers, but the books that are now in the Bible don't bear much resemblance to what they originally wrote. They have been changed over many years, and particularly in the first 300 years after my death, they got changed a lot. And so, you're not really getting a complete recollection or account of what really happened. The same applies to Paul and his writings. Many of the things that are now in Paul's writings in the Bible, because they're such a substantial part of the New Testament, they have been modified to suit the teachings of the ages over periods of time, particularly, again, the first 300 years of Christianity. That all being said, Paul had his issues, emotional issues. He had his originally when I first met him on the road to Damascus, he was quite a dedicated man to rubbing out the Christian faith, and he was also quite a violent man, and he also had a very poor opinion of women at the time. And obviously, as he imbibed more and more of my teachings through his interactions with people who knew me, he came to see that many of these things that he was doing personally were wrong, were unloving, and so therefore wrong. And so he changed over that time. Now, many of the things written in the Bible, some of those things that are written about Paul and arguments with James, for example, and so forth, some of those things are true, but not to the extent that they were sort of blown up afterwards. It's sort of like two of you having a disagreement, and then somebody, a third party who's not really very interested in the truth of your disagreement, exaggerates your disagreement in order to prove their particular point or whatever. And it is true that there were disagreements between Paul and James, but there were disagreements between almost everyone with what I taught, aside from Mary Magdalene, which most of the men never listened to. So the reality is, when I died, Mary had the most accurate view of my teachings. And then after that, probably John, the Apostle John, had the most accurate view of my teachings. But they were mild people. Mary and the Apostle John were gentle, humble people. And so very frequently they weren't listened to by people who were more arrogant and more opinionated. And many of those men had emotions, just like everybody on earth does now. And many of them also, if you think about it, came from a very, misogynistic society where they would not listen to women. And so, you can see that the development of the Christian faith, or so-called Christian faith, which bears no resemblance at all to most of the things I taught in the first century, the development of that faith was very much based around personal opinions of oftentimes very arrogant and opinionated men who wanted to change my original teachings to suit themselves and to gain power over women and to gain power over other aspects of society, politics and other aspects of society. So the reality is, yes, Paul did have some disagreements, and in some cases he was right. Like the Jewish law was certainly not worth following because it had very little bearing on the truth of how God views love. And there were many things in the Jewish faith that were unloving, and so therefore needing to be discarded. Just like today, there are many things in almost every faith that are unloving and need to be discarded because they are blatantly unloving. And Paul stood up for some of those things and got shot down a bit sometimes about standing up for those things. And then sometimes others, like John or Mary, stood up for some things and they got shot down for standing up with such things. So it was very much, you could think of the first century Christian faith very much in its developmental phase. And after I left, many distortions, even from the people who were listening to me, arose because they didn't understand at the time what I was teaching. And you could see even now, there are many times, I'm actually here now saying things, and the media and other people are all claiming that I did say things that I never said. And so you imagine if I wasn't here, it's going to be very easy then to claim that I said something that I didn't say, and also to modify what I did say based on your own hearing and your own assessment intellectually of what is a very emotional and message about love, really. And so, these kind of things are going to happen, and they happened in the first century with Paul and all the other disciples.
I had this idea. I wondered what you think of it. Obviously, you have knowledge of things that happened to you in the first century that are not found in the canonical Gospels or are distorted. Mm-hmm. Are you at all interested in producing a pure version of what you think people ought to know about your first period on Earth and what happened? Because I would like to write it if you do.
Yeah, great question. I am interested in producing such a thing. Obviously, to my mind, there are a list of different things of importance. Mm-hmm. And to me, my life is not that important. I feel there are much more important things than my life. For example, what humanity on Earth at the moment generally feels about God is a much more important issue to address than, the history of my life. But I do wish to obviously fix up or correct any inaccuracies that exist about my life, because many of the inaccuracies, unfortunately, have resulted in teachings that actually have confounded Christianity and caused more and more problems and divisions, rather than actually helping it. And so obviously, if you can correct many of these things, it may have the prospect of unifying belief systems rather than causing defragmentation of belief systems. That all being said, the most important thing we can talk about, I believe, is God and our relationship with God and our reception of God's love and the transformation of the human soul and what that gives us. But they are the kind of things that I taught in the first century, which were unfortunately distorted by the Bible account. So yes, I am going to have to, at some point, and even in this discussion, at some point say, yes, there are certain things that happened and they didn't quite happen that way that you're now believing they happened. There are other things that are not recorded that did happen. And then there are things that, obviously didn't happen at all, that were fabricated. And it's important to understand the difference. And when you understand the consistency of love and the consistency of truth is always consistent. It is not illogical. So whenever you see something in the Bible where I'm supposedly doing one thing on one hand and then doing something that seems almost the opposite thing on the next hand, then obviously there's an inconsistency there. And I'm not an inconsistent person, and neither is God an inconsistent being. So any inconsistency has to have been created through some other source other than the original source. And so, this will help you determine what might be true and what might not be true in such accounts.
Well, let me know if I may be of service. I would love to tackle that.
Yeah, Bob, it's an interesting thing to tackle. And I'm sure when we get a bit of time to spend face-to-face together, it would be a very interesting thing to discuss. And maybe even the discussions that lead up to the writing of the book can be recorded as well, because you'll find in those discussions, a lot of things become very plain that you can see through logic that many of the things claimed can't have actually occurred. Now, I can give you some examples of that. The Sermon on the Mount, which is a very common thing quoted, Matthew 5-7 and those kind of verses, that are quoted frequently as if I said them all in one hit, in one sermon. That's not the case. They are actually recordings of individual things I said over, many, many years that the Bible writers decided, in the case of Matthew, he decided to put them all together as if they were one sermon so that people could get the basic teachings in sort of one hit, if you like. And, he did that as a philosophical way of dealing, more of a logical way of dealing with the material. And as a writer, he just chose to do that. But unfortunately, over the years, it's now become distorted, and it's now claimed that that was one sermon being stated from start to finish, which is not the case.
Yeah, that's impossible unless Jesus was a multiple personality. Can you imagine? Wait a minute, he was just talking about this. What's this? And it's just a byproduct of collecting things. The Sermon on the Mount's kind of like Proverbs.
Yeah, it's a collection of statements that I made over many years, and obviously Matthew wasn't one of the first disciples. He was early in after my becoming at one with God. There was a period, my life on earth, it took me nearly 31 years to become at one with God in love, to become into the point of what I call born again. It took me 31 years to do that. And once I became born again, certain people came along into my life, listening to the teachings, and Matthew was one of them. But there were many people who knew me before I became born again in the first century. James, John, Peter, all of those people knew me for many years before, in fact, that I became at one with God. And so they knew not only what I was like before I became one with God, but also what I was like after I became one with God. And so, they had a personal experience of me that Matthew didn't have. So, Matthew could only listen to those things through hearsay because he wasn't there. In the case of Mark was a very young man when I died. He was only 15 years of age when I died. And I remember him as a young man. He used to spend a lot of time with myself and Mary. He basically, his parents, basically abandoned him. So he was a he was an orphan, and so he spent a lot of times with us in our travels. So he did have a personal experience of me over a period of time since he was about 9 years of age to 15. And so he knew me before I became at one with God and also after. But he, obviously when you're 9 to 15 years of age, you don't remember everything with clarity when you become 30 or 40 when he was writing the book. So, of course there's also, there's his writings in which he sometimes didn't understand things. And then other revisionists got hold of his writings and then they changed all of his writings to suit themselves in many cases. And so the book now bears very little resemblance to the book that he wrote. And this is a common occurrence with all the Bible books, unfortunately.
You don't mind?
And the same with all holy books, actually.
So on Mark, and this is important because there's always these topics that come up on here. This is like a question I would love to dive deep, and maybe we can dive down the road on this deep. Maybe you can give a simple answer, and then I got a really good question that I'd like to dive in, because
Sure.
I know that you need the time to answer, and I know that, and I don't want to cut you off or anything like that because I value that, and I don't want to be rude. But were there gospels? This is the simple question. Were there gospels before Mark? Were there other ones like primitive versions of the Gospels written about you, or was Mark the earliest gospel written about you?
There were people who wrote about me. If I can explain a little bit about the history there. Luke was a person I first met when he was 5 years of age. His father, he was a Greek, and his father came from Greece to see me one time, and he brought Luke along with him. He used to often abandon Luke and leave him home with a nurse, but in this case, his father brought him with him, and I met Luke for the first time when he was 5 years of age, and I had not yet become at one with God when I met Luke for the first time. But as it turned out, Luke eventually became my son-in-law because he married my daughter, Sarah, and he became my son. Of course, all that happened after I died. Mary Magdalene was pregnant with my child at the time of my death. We were married, and after my death, she gave birth to Sarah, and Sarah eventually met Luke, and eventually they married. And as a result, Luke spent a lot of time with Mary Magdalene. And so Mary, Mary did not write the books, but Luke wrote them. He was a well-educated person. He wrote many of the things that Mary dictated to him, much like a person would write today, where you dictate to a dictation device or to a person who's typing for you, and you dictate all of your memoirs or whatever. And Mary did a lot of that. And so there were many, many books, many, you could say, letters or written material that were written in that way, that were the very first writings that were ever written about my life. But again, frequently dismissed because of the misogyny of the times. There were many women in the first century who understood God's truth and understood the reception of God's love better than most men who listened to me did. And many of those women also wrote about those things. They were educated enough to write in some cases, and they wrote about such things. But none of those things either ever made the mainstream because, for the same reason, people didn't really want to know the complete story because the complete story was too human to share. They wanted me to appear like a god. And so if anything made me look more human, it was better that it wasn't mentioned or referred to.
Thank you for that answer. That's interesting.
Wow.
So, David, I want to ask one more, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Did you rise physically from the dead? So you mentioned how you've been alive for 2,000 years. That doesn't mean, and when you say that, that doesn't necessitate, that means you're physically alive. And this is a dispute. Even Paul talks about dying, the body in the grave and rising with a spiritual body. So my question is, are the Christians wrong when they say that you rose physically and they want to burn people at the stake who don't agree with the hypostatic union and different ideas like, was he physical? Was he not? Did he rise from the grave? Literally, like, my question is that, were you spiritually risen and ascended on high, or was it something like a physical resurrection? That's my question.
Sure. Look, to properly answer that question, Derek, you've got to understand the way the human soul and its attachments, the two bodies, are designed. So let's firstly have a bit of an overview of that, because we need to understand that before I can answer your question.
Okay.
God designed the human soul. The human soul is a complete unit. So you could think of it like a sphere, if you like, a complete unit. And when it incarnates for the first time, it splits in two, and one half of the soul connects to a spirit body and physical body that is actually created at the point of conception. And then the other half of the body goes to another spirit body and physical body, which are created at the point of conception in another pregnancy. And so basically the two halves of the soul split, and then two bodies are created at the point of conception. One is a physical form that you see in this dimension, and another is a spiritual body that you see in a different dimension. So they are two-dimensional existences. They look very much the same to each other. They both have genetic code. They are both structured in the same way, in the sense that they both have hearts, they both have brains, they both have limbs. You look identical almost in the spirit form as you do in the physical form. But the difference is that one form can be seen in the physical wavelength spectrum. So, you know, from the, you know, you could say red to violet spectrum, you know, the visible light spectrum, form can be seen, and the other form is seen in a different spectrum. So there are two bodies created at the time of conception, and one half of the soul connects to those two bodies. Now, what happens when you die, and this happened to me as well, and it's going to happen to you and everybody else exactly the same way as it always has in history, is when you die, there is a cord. The cord connects from the base of your skull down to the tip of your spine, and this cord people refer to it in the spirit world as a silver cord, and it's a cord that connects the spirit body to the physical body. And what the function of that cord is to transmit neurological, nervous system and neurological information, including information that comes from the brain of the spirit body to the brain of the material body. It transmits information from one body to the other so that you have a seamless existence. So you could think of that. So you could think of the physical body, almost like I suppose, a robot that the soul is functioning through, if you like, as is the spirit body. Now, when you die, the cord snaps. So what happens there is, instead of most of your all of your thought processes and all of your motor processes and everything else that are controlled by your spirit body moving through into the brain of the physical body, instead of that happening anymore, because the cord is snapped, now it's fully functioning in the spirit body only. And so now you're a spirit. And this is exactly what happened to me as soon as I died. So shortly after, while I was on the so-called cross, which was actually a stake, the two bodies separated. My physical body died, the cord snapped, and I came to look upon myself, as people describe, even in hospitals and so forth, in what are called near-death experiences. It's all the same thing. You come to look upon yourself and you can see your physical body, and you're away from your physical body and you can see it. Now, in that state, because I was at one with God by this stage and I knew a lot about God's laws, I can create other bodies out of matter. And that's what I chose to do. So what I did to prove to the disciples that the so-called resurrection, which is not really a resurrection, but rather a transition of one life into another, I wanted to prove to them that I was still alive. And the only way that I could do that for them to see it with their physical spectrum eyes, if you like, was for me to create a body they could see. And so I created many different bodies, actually, which I appeared to them over a period of nearly 50 days. I did that. And I think in the Bible that you can see there's inferences to that, because they didn't recognize me in each case. And the reason why they didn't recognize me is I created a different body in each case to materialize, to demonstrate to them that I was still alive. the very first person I did that with was Mary, because I love her and she's my wife. And so the very first person I did that to was Mary. Of course, she wasn't believed at the time. And so I had to do it with others in order to, and I had to do it with men in particular, in order for anybody to believe that it was actually happening. So there was a period of time where I did live on earth through these bodies that I materialized over a period of 50 days after my death. After that time, I appeared to more than 500 people during that time. So those 500 people came to know and see that I was still alive. And I spoke to them about the same things I spoke to them. I reminded them of things that I spoke to them about before I died. I could connect to them because I could remind them of events that occurred in their life with me that only happened between me and them. And so they knew that it could only be me sharing this information. And as a result of that, they then came to believe that there was an afterlife. And this is also why Paul said that as there is a physical body, so too there is a spiritual one. Because he had the experience of seeing my spiritual body as I materialized in front of him, but also he had talked to many of these people who had seen my life after my death and had interactions with me after my death. I just got to have a drink.
Thank you. No, that was
fascinating.
Complex. David?
Well, I mean, wow, I'm just going to rewind a little bit because you actually answered some questions that some of members of the group actually asked. Were you crucified on a stake or a cross, Doris? So you've clarified that it's a stake, which is a bit controversial as far as Christian fundamentalism is concerned.
But it probably shouldn't. It probably shouldn't be, because the way most Jews were killed, and the reason why Pilate killed me in that way was he wanted to make a point to the Jews. The way most Jews were killed, if they were condemned by the Jewish faith, was on a stake, just a pole hanging from a pole with your arms above. The way the Romans used to kill you on a stake was with a cross stake. And he wanted to show everybody that it wasn't his intention to kill me. It was the Sanhedrin's intention to kill me. So he wanted to make a statement, and he purposefully put me on a stake for that reason, to make a statement that he was not responsible for my death, which obviously wasn't strictly true, but that's why he did it the way he did it. Now, of course, the people who was killed with me, they were killed on crosses. And of course, the story gets modified in the telling and so forth. And in shorthand, everybody starts saying, well, you were hung on a stake or a cross. The reality was, if you look at the actual translations, you'll see I was hung on a tree, and which is probably the accurate way of saying it. And in my case, it was a stake, as if it really matters. Does it really matter how a person dies? Isn't it better to know how they lived?
David, did you have a question, or did you just want to touch on that?
I just wanted to touch on that, and actually, if you're more interested in a more in-depth kind of answer, I encourage you to watch a video that I watched, Jesus with Dr. Jeff Whitehood, I believe. Dr. Jeff is a psychologist. Dr. Jeff Whiteman.
Get the link in the description.
We'll get the link, but it's a fascinating interview. You cover this, and you also, just rewinding back a little bit as well, you also cover that you had a daughter named Sarah. From that interview, I believe she's living in the East Coast in Canada at the moment, if I'm not mistaken.
She is one of the people who have returned, but she does not want to do anything about that, and also wants to remain in complete denial of that at this stage. So I don't think there's too much more I can say without harming her choices of life,
Something that's going to, I mean, if there's a lot of Catholics watching, this may upset them, but 2 days after you were crucified, and this is going by the same interview with Dr. Jeff, you actually saw the Apostle Peter rape your wife, Mary Magdalene. Fascinating. Can you expand on that a little further? That's just, did you,
Wow.
you obviously, you saw that. Did you also mention that Peter was also a serial rapist? He was not a very good guy. And you actually gave a good explanation as far as Dr. Jeff actually asked you, why would you want to hang out with these guys if they're your apostles? I mean, these don't sound like very reputable guys to me. And you said, well, obviously I hung out with tax collectors and so forth.
It's not that I chose to hang out with them. It's more probably accurate to say they chose to hang out with me. And
right.
The trouble with Peter is that he was quite an arrogant fellow at the time he was living on earth. He's not like that anymore, but he's now a celestial spirit. In fact, an angel, what you would classify as an angel. But he on earth was quite a violent man. He had a very high opinion of himself. He had a very low opinion of women. But on top of that, he had a very angry spirit towards Mary. He always did the entire time Mary and I were together. He thought that Mary was manipulating me and controlling me somehow. He believed that my love for Mary was misguided. He believed that I would have been far better off marrying a good, what he classified as a good Jewish girl. And Peter himself had a very poor relationship with women. He was a very... he had a number of wives, which he also treated quite badly. And so the reality is that he never really embraced, till after my death, and way after my death, any loving attitude, actually. And so, it took him many years to embrace love as the reality of human existence, And so
this was after he died.
No, well, on earth he did eventually become a lot more loving person.
Okay. Right.
But it took him many years to do so. And he also, after he passed into the spirit world, went through many years of regret about his behaviour.
In the hells, as you described, in the hells?
Yes, he spent some time in the hells. He spent almost 50 years in the hells, actually, Peter, as did many of the disciples, actually. Judas spent even longer. So many of them spent a large amount of time there, mostly because they refused to embrace principles of love that I was teaching. One of the principles of love that I taught on earth was that women were equal to men. And of course, at the time, this was a very, very strange teaching indeed. And so frequently I would have Mary present when men were discussing matters, and the disciples tolerated it, but they were very angry about it. And frequently they used to talk behind my back about why I allowed Mary to be there, rather than saying that my love for Mary was, well, they didn't even see that my love for Mary was on the soulmate love basis, which meant that my love for her was always going to be stronger than my love for anyone else. And so, Peter was very jealous of that love, and his jealousy is what caused him, in fact, to finish up raping Mary after my death. And I know it's very disappointing for most Catholics to hear that, and many get very angry about that. But the reality is that it happened, and I'm only going to say what happened. There's no point in saying things that didn't happen, and there's also no point in whitewashing things just for the sake of a person's emotional experience.
I guess he kind of viewed Mary Magdalene as the first century Yoko Ono.
Exactly, if you want to put it that way. he viewed Mary as the main, and many of the disciples were in agreement with him, actually. They viewed Mary as, her background was such that she had I suppose you would call it a checkered background, and Mary can discuss some of those matters with you. But,
we'd love to have Mary on the show, by the way, at some point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I'm sure she will think about that.
Sure.
But she had a checkered background, a very harsh childhood, and her father sold her into prostitution when she was 12 years of age. Her father raped her from the age of 5 to 12, and she got pregnant when she was 12. And her father, when she became pregnant, sold her into prostitution at the age of 12. So she had a very difficult life. And I met her after she had finished with prostitution, and she was living in Magdala as a woman who owned a business that was helping other women to live and survive. And that's when I met her. And we knew we were soulmates as soon as we met, but it took some time for us to develop a relationship. And so we were married a year and a half before my death, and Mary was pregnant with Sarah, 3 months pregnant with Sarah when I died.
I think the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, kind of clarified that story in 1969 and denounced kind of what you've just said. And if I'm not mistaken,
yes, I suppose there's a lot of what Mary gets frustrated about.
For hundreds, thousands of years, actually, what you just said was taken by most Christians as correct. But
Right.
I think we're dealing with the Roman Catholics only. They kind of clarified that in a teaching in 1969.
Yes, of course, they never believed that I was married. And in fact, that is the main reason why they promote celibacy amongst the priesthood. But the reality is that all of us are intended to have, and as I said, the soul incarnates, it splits in halves. So you actually have another half of yourself out there, whether it's a male or a female. It can only be one or the other. And so, and I'm not saying, so I'm saying when the two halves split, each half can only enter a male body or a female one, obviously. And so your soulmate could be male or your soulmate could be female. But in the case of myself and my soul, the other half of me is a female, Mary Magdalene. And I recognized her as soon as I saw her. She took a bit longer time to recognize that connection. But unfortunately, a lot of the things still said, though, by the churches about my life is still false because it promotes some of the false teachings that they wish to continue with. And that's unfortunate.
Sorry, guys.
Just need to have a drink.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Price, I'm going to relinquish my next question. So you got two in a row you can have.
Well, I feel guilty.
Yeah, go for it, Dr. Price.
With other people having questions that have been submitted.
Oh,
Go ahead.
We've got way too many to get through. So
Yeah.
go for it. Yeah, go for it, Dr. Price. No, go for it.
You want to do his questions? Is that what you're saying? Ask people's questions?
Oh, no, they're just that David should probably read the questions that have been submitted so they get a chance to have an answer.
Well, there's so many.
You had one, David.
Yes, I know. Well, they've got a lot, but let's just start off with Vincent from Birmingham in the UK. He asks, were you first born as Michael the Archangel? And please tell us your experience if that is the case.
And the answer to that question, short answer is no. And the long answer is this. When I became, alive in the first century, I was one of those people who could speak to spirits, and I often did. And in fact, there's records in the Bible of me speaking to spirits who other people could not see. And I frequently did that. And I also had what are called some guides, some people who helped me understand love better than the average person. And one of those people was Michael, the person who's called Michael the Archangel. He was a person who also lived on Earth, but he lived on Earth nearly 150,000 years ago. So he's had a very long experience, of life, and he's lived in the spirit world, of course, most of that time, as has the so-called Archangel Gabriel and some of the others that are, sometimes referred to by the Catholic faith. Michael and Gabriel were friends of mine in the first century in that they used to speak with me often. They were in the spirit form and I was on Earth, and they used to speak with me very often. And for that reason, I could, tell other people what they were saying. Even though those other people could not hear them, I could. So frequently they would come and I would speak as if I was them. I would speak to the people who they wanted to speak to. And unfortunately, that gets misinterpreted then as me being Michael or having a history of Michael, which is not true. I am the person I am. I've only had 2,000 years of existence. I'm a relative newcomer to the earth in comparison to Michael and Gabriel. They've lived over 100,000 years. So, they've had a long experience of earth life. And for that reason, I was very interested in talking to them about Earth's history and what's happened over the thousands of years before I came to Earth, on Earth itself. And because they have observed all those things, they could tell me. So we've always had a friendship, and I still talk to them today. So,
David, keep going, brother. I think getting the guests or getting the questions from people who are fans is always
We've got to give Dr. Price the floor at some stage because I'm sure he's got a lot of questions. But Jesus, when this is from Lindsay from Vegas, a neighbour of yours, Brisbane. Yes. Jesus, when is your actual birthday? We know that obviously it's not December 25th. It's a pagan tradition. October, do you have a date? October or September, October at some point? Do you know the date that you were born? I mean, do you hold December the 25th is like a...
Firstly, in Israel at the time, we never celebrated birthdays. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And the time that I was born in the first century, of course, the way the lunar cycle works is very different to the solar dating system. And so the reality is I was born around about September the 27th, on 2 BCE, so 2 BCE. That was my birth date, around about, if you put it into a solar cycle. So, yes, I was not born on December the 25th. Again, that date was attributed to me because they wanted to have some joining between pagan philosophies and my existence as a god, that they wanted to promote. And so they gave me dates that belonged to pagan philosophy. And December 25th, as most of you would know, is, relating to the birth of the sun in the northern hemisphere. So the analogy being me, the firstborn son, the birth of the sun, and the birth of the sun in the sense of the sun entering the first, it's starting to increase in its solar capacity after that time in the northern hemisphere. And so, they tried to align those two dates. And also there were celebrations in pagan philosophy for the birth of the sun, for the new coming sun. And they wanted to try to incorporate Christian faith into the pagan religion in order to have some infiltration. And that happened 300 years, actually, or so after my death. So before then, you won't find any records of anybody celebrating my birth at December the 25th, but after 325 CE, you will find that there are then records of my so-called birth being December the 25th, and that was gradually taken on board over the next 400 years until such a time it became a celebration of my birth.
Bouncing back between you and Bob. I want Bob to make sure you're involved. So, do you have anything? There's so much, I know, but
well, of all of you, Bob would probably know more about the history of the Christian faith. Is that correct, Bob? That in terms of what happened with, how the Catholic faith even got developed, which is really an interesting, the Council of Nicaea and other councils that occurred where groups of men got together and decided what was canon and what wasn't canon, and decided to throw out things that, disagreed with their current philosophies and so forth. And these are all well known historically, really.
Yeah, I think that, well, for one thing, it's sort of a misnomer that the Council of Nicaea established the canon of the New Testament, though
that's right. It happened over a 300-year period, really. But yeah,
it wasn't long afterward. But they had their hands full at this council with trying to. I think of the song "Building the Perfect Beast." They're tinkering with the different theological elements that would make up an orthodox, proper Christ, as if it was just a kind of mathematical formula. It had nothing to do really with the life of the historical man. They're sort of creating it as they go, and it remains a pure abstraction, really.
It is, and the reality is it was done for political expediency. There was what was happening at the time was the Roman Empire looked like it was going to go into complete disarray because of the Christian faith and its teachings. And so the government of the day decided to imbibe the Christian faith as the state religion as a way of increasing its power, which they managed then to do for nearly the next, 1,000 years or more. And so, the reality is it was done for political expediency rather than any other reason. And very few of the books or the teachings that were imbibed at the time actually came from, those of us who lived in the first century.
Did King Arthur exist?
I don't, I've met people who claim to be King Arthur, but I've never met the actual King Arthur, so I can't really answer that question.
I didn't know if there was. I mean, I kind of wonder what you know after 2,000 years.
Well, Buddha exists, but you haven't.
Yeah, Buddha is a
person.
Buddha
is a person.
Yeah.
You haven't, from my understanding, you haven't been able to reach him. Is he still stuck in the sixth sphere, or you haven't been able to make contact with him?
I've met him and had conversations with him, but he is stuck in the sixth sphere of the spirit world. He refuses to acknowledge that he is an individual. He feels that he is a collective of individuals.
Who are we talking about?
Buddha.
Yeah. He is a man who used to live on Earth. And many of the teachings that he started with were quite loving to Earth in a way. They promoted the equality of man and so forth. But he was also a highly spirit-influenced person as well when he was living on Earth. So he could communicate to spirits as well when he was on Earth, similar to how I could. But he's now still in the sixth sphere of the spirit world. He lives quite an alone existence, actually, and he does absorb a lot of worshipful energy from Earth because there are many, many people who still consider him more like a god than a human. And so he basically lives off a lot of that feeling rather than accepting any new truth.
I always felt that the notion of the Buddha as a human is more powerful than the Buddha as an incarnate God, because it's in the story, he's sheltered, just as you described Joseph of Arimathea. His father Suddhodana knew that his son might become a great conqueror or a spiritual redeemer, and he wanted the conqueror thing.
That's right.
To that end, he kept the Buddha sheltered in the royal estate, so he wouldn't know there was suffering in the world. But he found out about death, sorrow, poverty, sickness, and all that, and it just blew his mind. And so here is a human being that says, I got to put a stop to this. I got to do something about it. Oh, man, what an idea. This man is setting out to save the world. It just kind of wrecks it when you say, oh, no, he was a god pretending to be a man.
Yeah, I feel a lot of affinity with him, to be frank, and that's why I've wanted to have conversations with him through my life. But unfortunately, those conversations have yet to have any success in terms of helping him progress from where he is. But I do feel he has had a great effect on people on Earth in terms of trying to influence them towards peace. And any person on Earth who does that is a fairly strange person generally, in the sense that it's rare to find such people who are willing themselves to die for the sake of trying to help people come to peace.
Jesus, I got a question, David, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Muhammad, okay? Obviously,
Yeah, great.
we're hitting big figures, right? So
Yeah.
this man was a military leader, a mighty military leader of his tribe of people. At least this is what is said about him. He listened to his father, or he didn't really necessarily.
He was raised by his uncle.
I was thinking Allah, though, but he wouldn't really consider him father. Maybe in part, in some places, there's
Allah begetteth not and is not begotten.
Exactly. So my question is, what do you know about him that we don't know historically, that we can't read in books, that we can't?
Well, a lot of what I would say would be controversial there too, unfortunately. But we
could probably do I'm sure we could probably do a whole episode just on this, but yeah. I'd love to hear your answer.
Again, it's important to understand the history of things probably. And the reality is that most Muslims today, when they refer to Allah, they're referring to what they believe to be the creator of the universe. But the original Allah, who Muhammad actually spoke with, was not the creator of the universe, but rather was a spirit claiming to be the creator of the universe. So he was a man who I've actually met as well, Allah. He was a man who lived on earth. He's now in the sixth sphere of the spirit world as well. He's a very loving man now, and we've had many conversations, but he is not the creator that most Muslims worship. And in fact, the Christian God, Jesus, is not the creator that most Christians worship either, right? The reality is that the real God, which is, who is all of our fathers, the father of all is probably a better way of saying that, is the creator of the universe. And I am a man, just as Muhammad was a man, and Allah was a man too, who used to live on earth. But what happened was that Allah at the time had a lot of good philosophy, which he felt would help Muhammad through his life. And therefore, in a similar way to how Moses penned the 10 Commandments, Muhammad penned an entire book, if you like, of teachings which were channeled teachings from another spirit. And Moses also was not at the time channeling God when he penned the 10 Commandments, but rather was channeling another spirit who was trying to help Moses and the Israelites come to a more loving condition. Of course, it was very difficult back then to do such a thing because people had a very strong tendency towards violence and self-protection rather than being in a loving condition. So these kind of men are unique in history for the reason that they started to encourage teachings that were against the general flow of the teachings of the day. So, Muhammad did that as well. So he was a prophet, as the Muslims claim, just as I am a prophet, just as the Muslims claim. But we are both, we're connecting to different sources of material. In his case, he was connecting to Allah, the spirit, not Allah, the God, this same God of a different name, if you like, that I was connecting to. And the reason why is because he didn't understand the flow of God's love and how that works. And unfortunately still does not. Muhammad is also in the sixth sphere at the moment. And again, I've had conversations with him too for the same reasons, because he was a person on earth.
You're good.
So I've had conversations with him too, because he was a person on earth who demonstrated the same kind of desire for peaceful behavior in the end. So even though he started out quite a warrior, he could see the violence and destruction and what it caused. And if you think about it, today, many people who go to war do see firsthand the terrible effects of war. They feel it on themselves, and they also see it, in society. And so many of them become strong advocates afterwards of a more peaceful resolution to things, and as he did. So you can see over the development of history, there are some people who have demonstrated leadership in the regard of trying to encourage peace, and unfortunately, there are other teachings that got translated into the Quran text that encouraged war, unfortunately, just as the so-called Christian text has a tendency to encourage the same thing. And so in that regard, they are very similar to each other. And what I find quite sad with regard to the Muslim and Christian faith is that they are so similar to each other in many regards, in that there is a very strong unloving teachings about God, what I would call even blasphemy about God, in that God is sort of treated like he's a warrior of some kind who's going to destroy the wicked, rather than a redeemer who is going to re-educate the wicked into righteousness. And I feel that is the primary fault of almost all the holy books in the way that they portray God.
Pause.
Yeah.
I got to change my battery. I'm sorry.
Okay, sure. No worries, man.
LR right here is about to die. Hold that thought real quick.
No worries.
I'm sorry, guys. It's interesting, and we got to try and wrap it up here soon, David, because you got to drive home.
No, I realize it's getting. It's like I realize that it's getting towards.
Must be pretty late. You're
9 o'clock.
It must be
9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, or.
Yeah, it's getting 9, and he's got an hour and something. And Dr. Price,
Sure.
He's not a god, so he's definitely getting tired.
No, that's
tend to be
cool.
one either, huh?
That's cool.
And we can have another conversation anytime you want, anyway. So
we would love to, but just let me know when you're back on air, Derek. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. So I mean, just going back with that Muhammad analogy, Jesus, just for our Mormon or former Mormon viewers, because we recently done quite a lengthy, or Derek did quite a lengthy series on Mormonism with David Fitzgerald and Bryce Bankenangle, I believe. In one of your interviews, you actually spoke with a believing Mormon, and a similar story to what you just said about Muhammad, where a spirit that didn't have the best intentions revealed himself to Joseph Smith. And you gave a similar analogy like with Muhammad. Have you met Joseph Smith in the spirit world? I mean, was his intention? No. Okay.
No. He's probably down on the ranks, huh?
He's probably stuck in the hells, right?
I wouldn't presume that. I can ask.
Right.
I can ask my spirit friends now where he is. He's actually in the third sphere of the spirit world, so he's not in the hells at the moment. He's progressing in the spirit world. So. As does everyone eventually, given enough time. You just found that out just now? You literally just
Did you? Yeah. Right, okay.
Interesting. No, I mean, I'm just wondering, you know what I mean?
Well, I just ask and they tell me.
Okay.
That's interesting. We have so much
there's so many questions, but for any Mormons or ex-Mormons watching, Jesus does, I think, 2 videos with a believing Mormon, and it's a great interview. You're really not bagging the faith in any way, shape, or form. In fact, you're almost endorsing it in a way as like a fair belief system. It's just that spirits, from what I understood from the interview,
say that, David.
Spirits with bad intentions talked to Joseph Smith, and that's kind of how it grew from there, from my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I sort of feel that every religious faith has certain teachings in it that have a grain of truth, or some, in fact, whole truth sometimes in it. And then other times there are obvious things that are quite false and are obviously created to support obviously a lot of the unloving behaviour at the time. So for example, in time when Joseph Smith received his channelings, there was a general feeling amongst some in America, the new Americas, that they should be able to have many wives rather than one, and some of the channelings also encouraged that view. And so it's like, and of course that also occurred in the case of like the channelings relating to, Muhammad, and also even in the Bible, it refers to a man having sometimes more than one wife. Although one wife was the preferred, the preferred option, it was sometimes encouraged to have more, or allowed at least by the faith. None of those things are God's opinion, of course. They are just humans' opinions, humans who want the ability, in this case, to control many women, and who are quite misogynistic. And so, unfortunately, in many faiths today, there is quite a lot of misogyny. There's quite a lot of really abusive women. And this is why in many faiths today, many women are not very attracted to them because of the way the faith treats women generally. And, this is something that's definitely got to change. People need to learn to treat their women and their girls the same way I treat women or girls, which is as equals. And I just sort of feel that, many religious faiths come from a history of not having women as their equal. So it's not right to say that I agree with any faith's teachings. There are some faiths that have some teachings that are correct, and then there are some parts of their teachings that are incorrect and obviously unloving, and also obviously illogical. And so it's best to discard those teachings in favour of more logic and scientific evidence.
I could ask a couple more if you are like of big names, maybe I can ask you about, and then maybe we could wrap it up for this show and we'll do another one. I really, first of all, I want to say before I even ask this, thank you. As you can see, we have probing questions. There's curiosity. Yeah. No ill intent, nothing like that. This has been a fantastic interview. And if there's one thing that I could walk away for anyone who's watching, skeptic or not, just love and compassion toward people is always promoted, no matter what you believe at the end of the day. And I just want to say that. So, Jesus, I find these interesting questions of things like, where is Abraham at? Was Abraham an actual historical person? I mean, a lot of scholars actually don't even think the guy existed, that this is actually a narrative invented. Are there any, and then in that question, I guess in asking that, you answer if he existed, if he did. Are there any people that didn't exist that were invented that you can say, look, that guy's not in the, he doesn't exist. This was actually a fiction.
It's a great question.
It's a good question. Firstly, about the reality of things, isn't it? The reality is I've met Abraham. So the man who is claimed to be Abraham in the Bible, I've actually met him and asked him about his life. So yes, he existed, as did Isaac and Jacob. They are all people who did actually exist, just like Esau existed, and other men that are also founders of other faiths and nations often have existed. Oftentimes there's a lot of folklore about them, though, or what you would classify as inflated creations. It's a bit like me arguing about my dad and how good he is, with you arguing about how you get your dad and how good you are. And sooner or later, one of us, if we're not interested in truth, is going to start exaggerating. And this is often what has happened historically. And unfortunately, a lot of that gets recorded as fact. And it's obviously distortion. So, I can tell you about Abraham's life because I've actually talked to him about his life and remember most of the conversations I've had. He is now a celestial angel as well. He lives in the higher spheres above the eighth, along with Sarah and also Hagar and also Esau, the man who is so-called founder of the, what is now known as the Palestinian lineage. He's also now in the celestial heavens as well. So there are a lot of people who have changed over their life in the spirit world and changed their views, just as a person who grows on earth here usually changes their view over the course of their life. And that's to be expected. If we're going to be growing individuals, we're naturally going to change our views. But yeah, Abraham existed. If you want to know more about his life, I'm happy to tell you about his life. But what would be even better, I think, is for most people to get to the stage where they can talk to him directly and ask him. And that's usually the best way to rather than getting everything third hand. It's usually the best way to answer most of these questions.
David?
Well, look, we've obviously got to wrap it up, but we would love to have you back on, Jesus, for another couple shows, because there's just so many questions that our viewers have, that Dr. Bob has, that Derek has. So we'll attempt to wrap it up, but just a couple last questions, I guess. You just mentioned lineage. Can you trace your lineage back to King David?
Well, the reality is I was of the tribe of Judah, and Mary Magdalene was of the tribe of Benjamin. We often knew which tribe we belonged to in the first century because it was well indoctrinated into you from your parents, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter, does it, where my lineage has come from? Yes, one of my,
just some people are just obviously fascinated by it.
Yeah, well, one of my forefathers was David. I've spoken to David as well, but as you do when you're investigating things in the spirit world, you get to speak to the persons you're hoping to find out more about. And David is obviously a friend of mine as well. So, I've gotten to speak with him.
Is the story in the Bible true in relation to King David, Bathsheba? It seems like a fairly harsh punishment that Yahweh would put to death.
Well, Yahweh doesn't punish anybody. So.
I'm just saying, is that fiction, or is that true? That the baby of Bathsheba had to die because of King David's sins. It seems a bit unfair.
That's what he believed at the time. Obviously, it's not true. The baby died, but not through anybody's specific sin. Obviously, the reasons why children die at birth are often to do with unloving things that have happened in many generations past that finish up putting a genetic imprint on the next generation. And so, unfortunately, children die for this reason. It's not God's intention that children die. And just like it's not really God's intention that any of us die, the reality is that we could choose when to die rather than die of old age, like many of us do. We only get old because of certain impurities that are now in our genetic structure. About 5% or less of our genetic structure has problems with it that causes us to age and die. But these particular things are all curable problems. So Bathsheba's son didn't die as a result specifically of that particular sin of David's or Bathsheba's.
It was recorded that way.
That's right. It's recorded that way because the people at the time believed such things.
Right.
And they believed that God was a punishing God, and they believed that if they did something wrong and their conscience bothered them, that something really bad was going to happen in the future as a result of the thing that they did. And unfortunately, sometimes even thinking that causes problems in themselves. So, a lot of these things are self-fulfilling as a result of our feelings and belief systems. But the reality is God does not punish anybody for things. God's laws automatically correct our sins. And if you think of sin, again, I feel that's another problem, is the definition of sin on the planet is very flawed. There's always stigma and judgment associated with the word sin. When I use the word myself in the first century, I used it in the sense of a sin is just missing the mark of the perfection of love. That's all. And many of us do that every day. We miss the mark of perfection of love. Every time we miss the mark of love, a negative consequence is going to happen because the law, God's laws, are governed by love. So every time we live in disharmony with love, there is going to be some negative consequence in our life, but not as a result of God's specific punishment, but rather the fact that we're just like breaking a law, just like jumping off a building would be breaking the law of gravity.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say, I would love to keep going because I want to find out. We've got questions. We're going to take your questions after this episode, you guys. Go in the description. You're more than welcome to email me. Be kind, okay? If you're not kind, I'm just not going to entertain the question. Cool. I understand if you don't believe what he's saying. I understand if you're a skeptic, but there's no reason to be an unkind person in this scenario. I want to ask questions down the road, Jesus, of the end. How's this world going to end? If there is going to be an end, did Adam exist? Well, let's go into other people in history. Let's talk more about what you remember, what you can recall of the 2,000 years of life that you've lived, and more. I'm sure the creativity of some of our audience who've watched, you might have a question, so send it in. Don't forget to support us. You guys can become a patron, of course, of MythVision. It helps us keep this show going and help Dr. Price. He has a Patreon as well. You guys go down in the description if you want to see more about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, his wife. You guys can go to the YouTube channel. You can check out their website, or you can wait for the next episode here, whatever you want to do. I really appreciate you joining, Jesus. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jesus. Awesome interview. Thank you.
Yeah, you're most impressive. I'm glad to have met you.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Bob. I think a lot of times people believe that it's impossible to answer certain questions, but the reality is my experience has been that God wants us to know the answers to everything. And any person who's honest with you will want you to know the answers to everything. And so that's all I'm going to be, is honest with you. And whether you believe me or not is another matter.
No, I thank you. You've been kind. I mean, yeah, you're not a dictator. You're not you don't go around telling people you better do, so.
No, exactly. And thank you for also going to such great lengths to make this happen. I know we had some technical issues in the last couple of days, but you've resolved those magnificently, and thank you for that.
That's worked all right.
Yeah, it's been great. No, thank you very much. Very much appreciated.
I want to say he almost walked on water just getting the internet connected here, because your internet was definitely giving you a pain. Yeah.
No, Mary did a lot of that work, so a lot of that has to go to Mary.
Actually, it was me, yeah.
Set up a lot of the tools, but
Carpenter.
she had the frustration of dealing with our telecommunications.
Naturally, that's the technology.
Oh, he said Jesus was a carpenter, and the Greek word known for that is technon, and he says, naturally, you're a technology kind of guy.
Yeah. Ironically, I wanted to be a carpenter in this life, but it didn't come about. So,
well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, guys. Do not forget, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I don't know how you can possibly forget that we are MythVision.